begin. So if you look on the screen now, there should be a bit.ly link, which will link you to these slides. So if you have any questions about these slides as we go through, you can use that link. In addition, we have hyperlinks embedded in the slideshow, and those will be live if you go to the slides. So if you have questions and want to link further, you can use the bit.ly link. All right, so we're going to start by introducing ourselves. I am Amanda Bastoni. I was a CTE teacher in New Hampshire and then a CTE director, and now I am at CAST, which is an educational nonprofit, and we have been doing quite a bit of work in New Hampshire. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. As some of you know, some of you may not, I'm Dan Dister. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the state of New Hampshire. Within the state government, I live within the Department of IT, but my purview on information security is the entire executive branch of the state of New Hampshire. And I've been fortunate enough in the past year and I've lost track, year and a half almost, to be working with many of the schools on something called minimum standards for privacy and security of student and employee data. And that's been a really interesting relationship, and I look forward to continuing to work with the schools on these issues.
Great, thanks, Dan. And just, I know we had one more person join us, so just a bit of housekeeping. If you're not speaking, please leave your microphone on mute. There will be Q&A time at the end. And if you'd like access to the slides there, I will put a bit.ly link in the chat. And if you have questions as we go through before the Q&A, please add them to the chat. All right, so we are having this conversation because of the situation we find ourselves in. Many teachers have never taught remotely before, and there are a lot of questions around what should teachers be thinking about related to data security as they move into this remote learning environment. The way we're going to run this webinar/conversation is I will be asking Dan Dister some questions. He will be answering them, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. As I said before, if you have questions along the way, please add them to the chat. So Dan, moving to remote learning can feel very overwhelming for the district, for teachers. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for how educators can begin thinking about using technology?
Right. Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that you know, all the schools have been using technology for a long time, and in the last year and a half, since the minimum standards and since RSA 189.66 was amended to include the privacy and security, you've been using security and privacy standards to evaluate applications, including online applications that you've been able to vet for your school to use. So I know that there are a lot of online applications, and I mean, what is remote learning? It's using an online application. So I think that there's a lot of things, a lot of capabilities that frankly you were aware of that now it may be a case of you're using it you know, 95 to 100% of the time. Before, you may have only been using it 5 to 10% of the time, but there are a number of applications that have been reviewed and vetted by different schools, which are totally online. And so I think we're really just going to be expanding that quite a bit, obviously. The thing to keep in mind is if there had been a particular application that you'd been using before, and you can expand your use, and they can expand the learning opportunities, you know, stick with what you know. Take some of those existing applications that maybe were only being used for one class or two classes, and expand it as much as you can. And you know, that's a lot easier than going out and getting a completely new service or application and kind of starting from scratch. So I think that's the first thing. If you have something you've been using and can leverage that and expand it, start with that. And you know, from there, there's a number of directions you can go after that point.
Great, Dan, thank you so much. And I know when we talked about this earlier, you also mentioned that if folks had questions, the first line of defense, so to speak, would be to reach out to their lead IT people. Do you want to maybe talk about that, and or whether folks should come right to the DOE, or what your thoughts are?
Right. Well, I think that in the group that I've been working with quite a bit over the last year plus have been members of the NHCTO, New Hampshire Chief Technology Officers group. And this consists of chief IT or technical officers from, I guess, every school district in the state, and they are a tremendous resource. They work collaboratively across the school districts. They exchange notes, and it's really a tremendous group that I think could be used as a resource to go forward for either using existing applications in an expanded form, or if new applications and online services need to be leveraged. I think that group is probably one of the best positioned to assist with that.
Great. And I do want to remind folks that are tuning in, please keep your mics on mute unless you have a question. And if you have questions, add them to the chat and we'll try to address them as soon as possible. But at the end, we will have a Q&A time. The last reminder maybe on this one, Dan, is I know some teachers, lots of teachers and parents and folks, educational leaders are nervous or have expressed concern. How do we make sure we're supporting all students when we move online? So, maybe just recommending that folks also loop in their special education coordinators around, if they have questions about technology and supporting specific students, that might be a good place to also go. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A lot of technology has been built around accommodating special needs, and again, there's nothing new. There's been technology to do text-to-speech translations for visually impaired folks. There are special types of displays options that can be used for people who are somewhat visually impaired but not totally blind. So again, I think there's a lot of technology options that are already out there in existence that could and should be leveraged for a lot of special needs cases. So I don't think of it as a completely different problem set. I just think that there are a number of software and technology considerations that can satisfy all kinds of special needs, and they've been in existence for quite some time. So we're not talking about something that's brand new.
Great, thank you, Dan. We wanted to add this slide here. It's important to remember that now this is a little older, it's been more than 10 days, but the feedback we're really getting from other countries and states who are taking this work on to move to remote learning is we really need to remember that less is more. So really, I want to try to encourage, we're trying to encourage teachers, educators to remember that parents are working from home, siblings are fighting for the computer, and it's just really critical that we think about pace and not overwhelming folks. It's a difficult time for everyone, and I think it's just important that we remember that that little key idea. And Dan, later you're going to share some tips with us about moving to remote learning. And when we were talking in preparation for this, you said, keep it simple. I remember that being one of the things you said. So, that's kind of the idea here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so question number 2, we just sort of touched on this, but when we think about reaching out to folks, you shared some information about this, and we talked about special needs, students with disabilities. What about reaching out to the DOE directly? Does that seem like something folks should do?
No slight on DOE, but DOE does not have they don't have an IT shop. The Department of Education, their IT needs are serviced by my organization, the Department of IT. When it comes to technical solutions, DOE is not going to be your first line of attack on that. I think that again, starting with the chief technology officer, the senior IT person in your school or school district is the place to start. And there are a number of organizations in addition to the NHCTO. There's I believe it's the NHSTE organization as well, that deals with technology and education. So there's several different organizations, and so reaching out first through your IT lead person, your CTO, they can leverage literally 100 different people with questions about technology solutions and what works and what doesn't work. So that would be the first start. And I know that if it comes to a particularly either a thorny security or privacy issue or an interpretation of policy, the NHCTO folks are not shy in reaching out to me to get a clarification on some of that, and I'm happy to do that. It would be fairly rare that I would need to go to the Department of Education for some sort of clarification, unless it comes down to a policy position that DOE has put out specifically. But I think a lot of that can be handled again from the technology folks collaboratively, or questions to me. I'm not exactly going to be the person to give um, solutions per se. I'm not here to give everyone what the answer is on solutions. I'm here to help with making sure that the solutions are going to fit within the minimum standards for privacy and security, that they follow reasonable best practices, and that kind of thing. So just make sure I understand, or explain that difference between what my advice is going to lead to versus going through the technology folks.
And Dan, we did share your email here. Would it be
Mhm.
all right if folks have questions after, at some point for them to reach out to you directly?
Sure, sure. I know there's at least 100+ people who already have my email address. So what's another 100 or so? Sure.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Great. Okay, so moving forward, we did collect some resources that we wanted to share with folks. The first, if you look over to the left, is the NHCTO that Dan has already talked with us about. Dan, maybe you could talk with us about Emergency Order 107.
Right. So, and that's, yeah, actually, I think it's just 7, right? It's
Oh, 7.
Emergency Order 7. So that was issued by Governor Sununu almost a week ago, I think, at least. Emergency Order 7 basically is a slight override of some of these privacy and security requirements in RSA 189.66. Basically, what that emergency order says is that school districts should not be imposing individual privacy and security standards to vet applications, that in effect they should be assessing these applications or vetting them against the minimum standards, and basically using only the minimum standards. As I've read that emergency order, it really is just meant to simplify the process for vetting applications that can be used with what's existing in RSA 189.66. It says that schools are to come up with their own privacy and security governance plan, in which basically the school districts can come up with additional standards if they wish. They can leverage additional requirements for privacy if they want to. But so what that emergency order is doing is saying, for this particular emergency and for the massive increase in distance learning, let's just stick with the very basic minimum standards for privacy and security as that vetting standard, and kind of cut out the individual school districts being able to require more strenuous requirements on the vendors. So that's what Emergency Order 7 does in effect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We also wanted to share with you Learning Designed, which is our platform where folks from New Hampshire can access.
I know.
Um, it's where folks from New Hampshire can access more webinars like this and other resources. And then we also wanted to share the link to the remote instructions for the New Hampshire Department of Education. I'm getting some information in the chat that that the bit.ly link is asking for people to, it's not open to all folks, so don't worry. At the end of this webinar, I will fix that and I will share the slides so that you have access. Dan, you also put together remote learning best practices. We have that collection shared here.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. They're pretty simple. I was actually requested by the Department of Education to come up with a short checklist on remote learning best practices. And so you should have access to this document either through a link or it can be emailed to you. The Department of Education was going to post this. I don't know if they've done that, but regardless, I'll just kind of go down the list because they're pretty short. 10 things. First item, ensure all computers used for remote learning are up to date on security patches and antivirus software, and enable the personal firewall on the computer. Number 2, use private or home-based networks for remote learning whenever possible. If you must use a public Wi-Fi network for remote learning, do not conduct sensitive personal transactions, for example, online banking or shopping, over that public Wi-Fi connection, as they can be observed and recorded by anyone else on that public connection. And just to elaborate on that point itself again, we would always prefer remote learning to be done like in the student's home, or it could even be done in a friend's home using that family's network. Those would always be preferred over someone trying to do remote learning from, a Panera or something like that. Those public open Wi-Fi networks are just they're like a cesspool. You really don't want to deal with that. Number 3, do not download or install any applications on the remote learning device unless explicitly directed to and approved by the school. So one thing I'll mention about these 10 kind of tips is that they're not all geared for one level. Some of these tips are meant for students, some are meant for the teachers, some are meant for the technical folks, and some are meant for the school districts at large. So if you're wondering, well, who these apply to, they apply to kind of all different categories in this whole remote learning environment. Number 4, do not run applications which are not a part of the current learning session and could affect the performance of the remote learning session, such as running gaming applications or streaming media like YouTube while you're trying to do remote learning. That's geared towards the students. Number 5, this is geared towards teachers primarily because they'd be the ones to enforce it. Minimize as much as possible the entry or use of student or teacher personally identifying information, PII, in any remote learning application. Any optional information fields presented by an application should be left blank. So the process, what I refer to that particular item is, we'll call that data minimization. If you need to get students to use a particular online application and the application wants their name, their full name, their address, their phone number, all this kind of stuff, I hope they don't ask for that, because I certainly wouldn't really expect us to do that. I would expect at most it would need a name and an email address perhaps. And it might ask for optional information about the students, but there's no reason to provide any more information that's absolutely necessary to use these applications. These companies, they may try to resell information, they may use it for future marketing, so they should get as little information as necessary to use that application. Number 6, remember that even secure, vetted applications can be misused during a session. If you see student PII being entered or displayed in an inappropriate manner, shut down the session and restart it. I guess this is pretty much geared towards teachers. Warn all participants about minimizing the use of student PII. So that's kind of, I think that's got to be the new normal at the start of a lot of these online video sessions. Kind of just a warning to everyone that they should minimize the display or the verbalization of student PII information. Number 7, and this is one that I've kind of really already mentioned, stick to known and previously vetted remote learning applications or online learning portals as much as possible. So, go with what you know. Number 8, applications that have been vetted against the New Hampshire minimum standards by another New Hampshire school district should be acceptable for other schools to use. That's the concept of reciprocity. There should be no real need for 50 or whatever, any number of schools to vet the same application over and over and over again. So let's consider that there's a concept of reciprocity, especially in the present time. So number 9, applications that can demonstrate national or international security assessment and certification should be acceptable for use by any New Hampshire school. Examples of recognized security certification standards which meet or exceed the New Hampshire minimum standards include evaluation against NIST SP 800-171, NIST SP 800-53, ISO/IEC 27001, SOC 2, and FedRAMP. Now, that's a whole bunch of alphabet soup that everyone may not be familiar with. NIST, that's from the National Institute of Standards and Technology under the Department of Commerce. ISO, IEC, that's an international security standard. SOC 2 is also that's an internationally recognized audit standard which focuses on security controls. And FedRAMP is a federal program which does vetting of cloud-based applications. So that's very specifically germane, I think, because if there's an application that you're contemplating using and they can say that they're FedRAMP, whatever, level 1, level 2 certified, and they have some documentation to prove it, that well exceeds, I can guarantee that well exceeds the New Hampshire minimum standards for privacy and security. So if an application can prove any of those things, and I will emphasize prove it, I think that we should be able to move pretty quickly with using those. And the last item, this is kind of always the last item from the security folks, know who to call if you see unusual or suspicious internet activity, oddly behaving applications, or cybersecurity incident on the remote learning device. I believe that in most cases, the first place they should call is going to be the chief technology officer in that school or school district. And if it becomes a serious enough security incident, they can certainly pass it up to the state here, and making sure that they notify all the appropriate people within the school district as well. So that's the whole group of 10. There's some pretty heavy duty items there as far as tips. I know that just doesn't roll off the tongue very easily, but again, I think these are kind of the broad assortment. They address things at the student level, things at the teacher level, and some things at the school level as well, to think about when we have to move to this complete remote learning environment. So I'm happy to entertain any questions on any of those points, or any other larger questions that are coming up. Just let me know.
Great. We don't have any in the chat yet. We have one more slide to go through, but I was curious, when we look at this list, this must also apply, Dan, to, a lot of students are using their cell phones, right, as their remote device. Is there any additional, kind of advice you would give when we think about students using not just desktops and laptops, cell phones?
Well, so I mean, the thing is that a student's personal cell phone is their personal device. So is the school district allowing students to use a personal device for the remote learning? And if so, then it falls into that bucket. You know, a cell phone is just a really, really small computer. It has all the same computing capacity as many laptops or other desktop devices. So it should be treated in all respects as a computer. So if they're using that, and if you're allowing them to use a personal device versus a school issue device, then the same types of things apply. The one thing I will mention, though, that typically cell phones, they have a lot of capabilities that maybe aren't always enabled on laptops even. They have a lot of collaborative online applications. They may have, you know, Facebook plugins and all that kind of thing. And all that might be enabled, and that could actually be a little bit problematic if they're using that for remote learning, because it's got all that other stuff going on basically. And so again, it really depends on the school's tolerance and acceptance of personal devices to be used in this particular distance learning situation, just because a cell phone could pose a bit more of a problem when it comes to performance and functionality, and you know, other things going on that cell phone at the same time they're doing distance learning.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dan. So I've paused my screen for a second. I'm going to pull up the slideshow again. I think our last question actually on the slideshow, Dan, was which of these 10 topics do you think is the most important to pay attention to? We had that question for you.
So I mean, as a security guy and as someone who wrote them, of course, they're all important. But I think that in the end, what I would emphasize the most is something that probably is not heard often enough, and that's the concept of data minimization. Um, you know, it's always a matter of degree, and this has always been the case as a security person for I don't know, 22 years that I've been doing this job. Um, it's one thing to spill one piece of data. It's another thing to spill 100 pieces of data. So it becomes really a matter of degree, and the more information that is collected and potentially exploited or spilled or compromised, the worse off it gets. So when it comes to using applications, you know, if you want to go full paranoid mode, you could even assign uh, you know, just basically anonymous names to your participants if you want to, and keep track of them yourself. But if the application requires an email address, which I'm sure a lot of them do, you're going to have, you know, the students will have to provide an email address when they're using that application. But again, as a matter of degree, the application, the program, the vendor may say, okay, we want all this other information from the students. Unless it's absolutely required, do not provide it. So minimize the level of information that's provided as much as possible. If you can go with anonymous bills for participants in online learning, that even distances the person from the real data even further. But I think in general, that's probably something that a lot of people may not think of. I know that when I, you know, go for some sort of online application, free services, services that cost money, you know, they'll ask for, you know, a page or 2 pages of information. And I'm looking for what absolutely is the minimum amount of information I can provide in that form, because I don't want to give them all that information. You know, they can use that for marketing. They can use it for, you know, machine learning to try to figure out who is interested in their application, and you know, they run all kinds of interesting studies to try to suck people in. So, you know, the least amount of information that can be provided by students or teachers that is necessary is best. You know, the absolute minimum that's kind of the one thing that I just like to reiterate, because I don't know if that comes up often enough. But I'll just kind of throw it out there and see if there's any questions.
If you have questions, everyone, feel free to, maybe I should, if you can can't unmute yourself. I can unmute you. You can add a comment in the chat. And Dan, we did, when we were talking about this, we did say there is some good news. We were talking about when the questions come up, most of them are similar. Maybe you want to just talk about that a little bit if you have time.
Right. So, I think that with the collective group of, say, for example, the folks who participate in the NHCTO group, uh, they've covered collaboratively, they've covered so many different situations, so many different types of applications. They've solved these issues in some schools that maybe other schools are just starting to get to. So, don't feel like you're alone out there and you have a completely unique requirement, because chances are pretty good that some other school has tackled that particular type of requirement, that technical need, or even a particular application that you're being asked to use. So you really need to reach out. You need to use that network of folks who have a broad experience, a lot of really great folks who've done a tremendous amount of work when it comes to vetting applications and making sure that learning happens, whether it's at the school or remotely. So uh, I, I, I would be surprised if there's a completely new kind of requirement that someone hasn't already implemented in a particular school district. I'm sure it's possible, but like I said, there's a real collaborative group of folks who have addressed many, many problems, and so starting with that kind of group, I think, is really your first and best bet.
Great, Dan. So we did have a question. We have two questions. I'll share the first one with you. What's the best way to determine if an application has one of the certifications you mentioned? And then is there a list of, you said there's a list of applications that the state has already approved. So that's two questions there.
Okay, so in terms of determining if an application has one of the certifications, um, the best way is to go to the website itself of the application. I've done a little bit of the snooping around myself to assist folks from DOE who asked me a question about some of the Google applications and about Zoom. In both cases, I wouldn't say it was easy to find, and I usually can make sense out of where they would post information about their security, but it did take a little bit of hunting around to find their privacy and security certifications, if you will. So you can find it directly on their websites. Again, we're somewhat taking their word that they're not just outright lying. If it's a major company, chances are they're not going to just be making this stuff up. For both Google and Zoom, I found evidence where they talked about certifications for ISO 27001. In some cases, I think one Zoom application maybe even had proof that they had done a SOC 2 evaluation, which is just really a very kind of difficult certification audit process. So again, we kind of are a little bit at their mercy. Hopefully they post the documentations, or if you're consulting with them about potentially using their application, ask them to point you to the appropriate documentation. In one case, I found there was a vendor who had what looked like a kind of a certified PDF form, and this PDF form, again, I accepted it as adequate proof that they had conducted a security assessment to a particular set of standards. So, the first bet would really to be asking that application, that vendor, to show evidence that they've gone through one of those recognized security certification standards. Uh, I wasn't actually trying to secure those applications for the state to use. So all I was doing was just browsing on their website to find the information. But if you're going to enter into some sort of official obligation, potentially even contractual with these companies, you have a right to ask them to prove that and to provide evidence of that. So
Great. And
that's the,
is there a list, Dan, of applications that have been approved by the state so far?
well, Not exactly. If you look at the DOE website, they have a list of quite a few applications, including some of the ones that we've talked about, Google for Education and Zoom and a number of other applications that everyone has heard of. But they put a disclaimer at the top of that list. The disclaimer is that it's still up to the schools to evaluate that against the standards, the minimum standards for privacy and security. The lawyer from the Department of Education was rather insistent on putting that disclaimer because he didn't want the Department of Education itself to be a certifying body. And if you look at the state law in RSA 18966, there's nothing in there that says the state shall certify applications. So the Department of Education is very hesitant to do that. I guess I can understand that. They don't have any IT people. They don't have any IT security people in the Department of Education. They're trying to hire one. So if you know of anyone, have them talk to the DOE. But they specifically, for a lot of reasons, did not want to become an official certifying body. So they do list a number of applications, and I would imagine that if you took some of that list, you find something they're interested in, and if you talk with the technology officers group, you'll find that that's been evaluated by some number of other schools. So the vetting has probably been done on a lot of the very popular ones. But as far as like, a completely blessed and approved list, you're not quite going to find it in as easy a form as everyone would like. That would I know that would make everyone's day easier, but not exactly that simple. In some cases, folks have asked me to dig around and using some of my background to try to determine whether we believe the application is reasonably certified and approved for privacy and security. And I've helped out on that as well. Usually I've just been communicating with the folks from the NHCTO group, but again, happy to assist with that as I can. I think that now that we're a number of days into this new environment, I hope the big rush of approving applications is already kind of over. It was pretty hectic, I know, for everyone. The first few days, that was just crazy. Hopefully we can be a little bit more deliberate in any evaluations and checking to make sure if they show up on various lists that have already been looked at by other schools, and then assessing whether they've been evaluated according to recognized security standards.
Great, thank you, Dan. We have another question. If it ever happens and data is exfiltrated, who do we contact at the state?
Well, it would probably be me, but at the same time, you would have to contact, I would say really two things. A data breach of student data or even teacher data has to be reported to the Department of Education. So that's a given. That's in the law that a data breach involving that type of data has to be reported to DOE, and DOE then has an obligation to compile an annual report about data breaches. However, DOE is not really going to be digging into that particular incident. Like I said, they don't have any technical folks to assist. So from the other side of that particular issue, you could dual report it to myself as well. And if we can assist in running down what happened, how that happened, we'll help out with that as we can.
Thank you so much, Dan. So another question, is the Privacy Shield framework from the Department of Commerce a certificate that can be included in the list you provided?
Yes, I did see that. I didn't list it on my the top 10 things. The Privacy Shield framework seems to be pretty good. I don't know if that would be the only thing I would look at. I would hope they would have some other certification as well, because believe it or not, there are actually somewhat different schools of thought on security versus privacy. They're not always the same. So the Privacy Shield framework seems to be a pretty good type of process. But as far as meeting basic security standards, I think I would also look for some of the other certifications as well. And I know that when I was looking at one application, one of the major applications, they had like 4 different certifications listed. So um, I would hope that if they have a Privacy Shield kind of certificate, that that's pretty good. But I would look for maybe a little bit more of the security side certification as well.
Great. Okay. So we would love to have, does anyone have any other questions that they would like to voice or write in? I'll wait for a minute, and then I did have some maybe ideas too. Okay, Dan, so one of the questions that I had was, are there other resources for folks who have questions about how to support students in special education? I think the Department of Ed has somewhat, do you have any other resources or links or ideas for who we should contact if we wanted to get more support for technology with special education students?
Well, I think that there's probably resources at different levels. Certainly, the State Department of Education, but the U.S. Department of Education as well. And again, we have to keep in mind that accommodating special needs students is not something new. It's not something unique to this distance learning environment. So I would say that in a U.S. Department of Education, which, and I will admit, I've looked through their site any number of times, and it's a lot of information. Sometimes it's hard to find what you're looking for, but there's an awful lot of information there. So at the state level, at the federal level, I know there's information out there. One thing I'm not particularly knowledgeable about, but I'm sure there must exist a grouping of special education instructors, teachers, and some sort of collaborative group as well within the country. I'm sure there must be any number of groups. I'm unaware of them, but I'm sure that a little bit of hunting around would find that there's an association that focuses on that specific need and that specific set of requirements. So certainly someone who kind of has that requirement should seek that out, and I'm sure it's out there. I mean, there's so many groups that have focused on specific aspects of education, including special education.
Yeah, great. I did share one that I'm aware of, which is the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. So that's the AIM Center, and they really focus on, there's strategies, links, ideas for making sure that all materials, including technology, that you share with students are accessible, or how to utilize tools that are often embedded in the application to make the technology more accessible, which you referenced early on. So that's fantastic. I just wanted to turn this out to the group that's gathered. Do we have any other specific questions? I really want to encourage people to take the time to, you've joined us on this webinar conversation for a reason. Hopefully we've answered all your questions, but it's very likely and highly possible that we have not. So if you had some specific questions, we would love to hear those at this time.
It's just your chance to stump the panel here, so feel free.
Yeah, that's great. And just to remind everyone, I have shared the link to the slide presentation. I changed the settings, so you don't have to get that approved. I've approved everyone who's asked so far for a link to the slides. And just friendly reminder, in the slides, we do have links to resources, including Emergency Order 7. And we also have links to Dan's tips on best practices for privacy and security. Dan, so when you hear about schools moving to complete remote learning, Were you afraid? Not afraid. What were you, what's one of your biggest fears, or, do you have some, thoughts about how do we do this well? I know you've shared the tips, but anything else?
Well, so it's the same thing that I've been telling the folks here in the state until I'm getting hoarse. Just because we're in this emergency situation, we cannot and should not throw out standards for privacy and security in favor of just getting something done fast and quick. So we have to keep in mind that uh, this particular situation, as everyone should have figured out by now, is not going to resolve itself in a matter of weeks. It's going to be a matter of months. And if there's not even going to be a vaccine until next year, there's still going to be a lot of things that aren't going to be back to normal. I certainly can't predict how long full distance learning will be required. However, uh, again, it's going to be a matter of months, I'm fairly certain. So we can't do uh, inadequate measures. We shouldn't rush to get something done at the expense of security or privacy. We can't just throw all the rules out the window because we think, we have to get something done, in a minute, an hour, because they're put in place now may be in place for quite some time. So let's not be careless as we proceed. Let's try to keep all the same requirements in mind. I know that it's a much more challenging environment for a lot of reasons. And I've the same lecture folks here in the state here. There some people are requesting things that, well, frankly, they're stupid. I mean, there is such a thing as asking for something so fast and so stupid that it's not well thought out. And we need to be deliberate. We still need to be cautious. The privacy and security of students and student data. And I've said this before. I know when I've talked to the various groups that if a lot of information about students is exposed and lost now when they're in junior high, elementary school, high school, it won't come back until someone has decided they want to compromise that person when they're a working adult. So this could really be a long game problem. So you might say, well, okay, this fourth grader had all their information exposed. But what's going to happen with it? Well, when the fourth grader is a working adult and someone has all that information from their home life, they may be able to steal their identity at some point. And they'll steal their identity when it hurts, when they're a working adult, not when they're a fourth grader. So this is a problem that, protecting the privacy and security of student data, it's very important for their future. So again, let's not cut corners just for the sake of expediency. We need to do the best we can, given all the circumstances. And I know that we're not in a perfect situation. Sometimes we can't make perfect decisions. We refer to it as a risk-based decision process in the world of cybersecurity. You're always balancing risks against each other. The risk to get something done, the risk to not get something done. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind, and I appreciate everyone's interest and attention and trying to do the right thing while also accomplishing a very uniquely challenging learning environment. And I appreciate that, and certainly appreciate all of your efforts to do things the right way.
That's great. Okay, so I wanted to say two things. I know that Chris Sununu today, our Governor Sununu today, issued a stay-at-home order until May 4th. So at least we will be, in this situation until May 4th. And the other thing I was thinking about, Dan, is I really appreciate what you're saying around, this risk-based, because it's very new for teachers and educators. Some of them haven't been put in situations ever before, where they're having to teach remotely. So it does feel like a slippery slope for them, or a risky environment too, as they're trying to reach out to students, connect and create culture and learning, and then also secure their data. So that's why I thought it was very nice of you to come on and talk with us. An individual has asked, can you talk about students being on video
Mhm.
using webcams and privacy? What is
Mhm.
okay, and do we need a signed document for all students? And for example, I know many teachers are asking students to make, or some teachers are asking students to make video responses. You
Mhm.
record yourself, especially for some of our hands-on, our art classes maybe, or woodworking classes. So teachers have a lot of questions about that.
Right. So I guess at least in my mind, the bottom line is that a new statement or some sort of approval document is not necessarily needed. If everything is kind of used as appropriate, used as it's intended. The problem is, as we all know, is that any application, as I mentioned, can be misused, and that's the concern. That's why the students need to be reminded of kind of the best practices at the start of some of these online video sessions. They should the video camera itself, the way it's set up, should not capture other people in the family. It should be very close. It should be fairly restrictive and not kind of display other people or other even if they live in the same house. It's basic privacy. Your arrangement is with that student, not with the whole family at that time. So be reminded about setting up a place where they can be uh, alone during the video session, so that other family members don't show up on the video. Um, and certainly, like I said, any application can be misused. So, but as far as my interpretation is that no additional special documentation is needed for that, as long as it's used appropriately. And again, I'll go all the way back to the beginning and say that I know that some of these applications, online applications, some with video capability, have already been in use. So now there may be an existing parental permission that was signed for that application. If there is, that's great. Don't throw it out. I would certainly keep it in hand. But I think the biggest concern, assuming that we know that the video service being used is something that's been vetted. It's maybe it's the Google application, maybe it's Zoom. Um, the biggest problem in my mind, and the biggest thing to think about, is not getting 100 permission slips from groups of students, but it's making sure that it's used appropriately, and that the students understand how they should use, how their webcam should be set up, and that it should not expose other family members, expose thing that is outside the immediate purview of that student and that student's relationship with that class.
Great. We do have a question, Dan, and I'm trying to make sure that I understand it. Maybe you will understand it better. So we have folks wondering, based on information from a CISA document, do you know if IT people's status has changed based on the governor's order? We know this doesn't necessarily relate to privacy, so maybe if you're comfortable answering, that would be great. But this idea of I think, well, I'm going to turn it over to you if you understand the question.
Um, Not exactly. I don't fully get it. A CISA CISA, that's the part of DHS that deals with cybersecurity. Um, I know been putting out a lot of advisories of late. Mostly they're cautionary. They talk about things to watch out for. And of course, a lot of things they caution about are things that kind of back into some of the 10 tips, best practices. If you follow the best practices, you shouldn't have as much of a concern with falling prey to some of the concerns that CISA puts out. We know that there's a lot of phishing going on, emails going out that are telling people, hey, here's information about COVID-19. And it's not information about COVID-19. It's a phishing attack. They may try to distribute ransomware even to that person. They may try to get the person to click on a link, and that link will compromise their computer. So In general, I'm aware of a lot of that kind of security advisories that have been coming out. But I'm not quite sure about kind of the way that you've phrased it. If you could go further, or if there's someone else who
Uh,
can expand on that.
so I guess the question is, are IT staff considered essential staff? Can
Essential staff.
yeah,
Well, I don't think, in this case, the federal guidance is not going to drive who's essential within the state. That's going to be a state level decision. So, as far as who's essential, uh, either that's already been covered in some of the emergency orders by the governor. If it has not, or if it's not been addressed by the Department of Education, it really needs to come from the state. So federal guidance on essential personnel, yeah, I would take that with a grain of salt. Just like the federal government can't tell a governor to drop your self quarantining, they can't tell a governor to just stop everything you've been doing on social distancing and just go back to normal. The governor is in control of that. So, as far as IT people being essential, uh, well, in the state, a high percentage of all IT people are considered essential personnel. Uh, I would just kind of consider that a given, the nature of our job. And not only that, if you're in a 100% remote learning environment that's reliant on technology, yeah, your IT people are going to be essential. So that's a determination that, again, I wouldn't look to the federal government for anything that I would consider authoritative. I would look to the schools to make that call. I could look to the Department of Education, or in some cases, if the governor wants to make a declaration on that. So, um,
I have
I.
a little help for you, Dan. I
Mhm,
did some Googling real quick, and
mhm,
there is WMUR did the press release of
mhm,
the governor sharing, and there is a short list of
mhm,
businesses that will remain open and businesses that will close.
mhm.
But a full list is expected to be released soon, but has not at this.
Right. Well, that's kind of the conundrum, though. I mean, schools are not closed. Schools are open, but they're in a completely different environment. So, yeah, it's not the same as just saying that, any kind of organization like theaters need to close. Uh, schools are closed, but you're still operational. So, yeah, I think that if it's not been made explicit as far as IT personnel, and you know, same thing. Well, does someone need to say that teachers are considered as essential personnel, or is that just a given? I don't know, but again, I think that's a decision somewhere between the school, the State Department of Education, and the governor on that front, as far as who's considered essential within the state for any particular type of position.
Okay, great. So we have a minute left. I think if we don't have any burning questions, which it doesn't seem like we do at this point, then I am going to thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. We had a great turnout, anywhere from 31 to 23 participants. So I think that's fantastic. And I just want to thank everyone who did join. Hopefully this was useful. We will be recording, or we are recording this, and we will share it out through Learning Designed. I'll also share it with Dan. We'll make sure everybody has that link. Dan, you have 30 seconds, any last words?
Uh, be safe, be secure, and stay healthy.
All right, thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.